Hey, welcome to episode 159 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. Yes, that's a lot of amazing guests and a lot of fun conversations. Have been extremely lucky. And today I get to share a guest with you who's really risen to the to to amazing heights. I mean, he's seen needs and he's jumped in and he's met them, and I don't want to spoil it. So I'll be back in just a second.
Today's guest, Drey Samuelson.
Welcome back to Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. Let me tell you a little bit more about Drey. I find Drey compelling for taking a stand for the things he wholeheartedly believes in. Taking action like this can come with tremendous successes as well as phenomenal challenges and sometimes heartache. Born and raised in a small town in eastern Nebraska, Drey has spent most of his adult life involved in South Dakota politics. He served as U.S. Senators Tim Johnson's only chief of staff throughout the entirety of his 28-year congressional career. Yes, you heard that right, 28-year. That's awesome. Drey contributed a chapter to MoveOn.org's 50 Ways to Love Your Country and believes that everyday people working together can make substantial changes in the world they live in. Please help me welcome Drey Samuelson. Hey, Drey.
Hi, Jason. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
So you mentioned when we were talking last week that as a kid you loved comic books. What did you love about? What intrigued you as a kid about comic books?
Well, that's a good question. When I was a kid, a long time ago, a lot of my friends wanted to play Army and cowboys and Indians and stuff like that, and I had no real interest in that. I was much more interested in my imagining different realities rather than playing them. And the comic books sort of intrigued me. They were moral fables in some ways, but they were also so interesting to me. I loved the artwork and I loved the stories. I've loved stories all my life, so that was. In fact, when I would the kid that grew up behind me would invite me to come down and play wiffle ball, but I was always more interested in reading his comic books because he had some. And he would literally do is he would hide his comic books. So when I was down there, I couldn't find him, and then I'd have to play wiffle ball with him. But it's kind of a sad commentary that my friends would have to hide their comic books because otherwise I'd rather do that than play with them. But it's a true story.
What do you love about engaging with imaginary realities like the ones in comic books?
I don't know the answer to that, but I think they always spoke to me. I have a very, I think, creative imagination, or at least it's an active imagination. I don't know how creative it is, but I just took to those. It just seemed like they were talking directly to me, in a way that some other experiences that I had as a child really didn't speak to me, and they weren't nearly as enjoyable. So I threw myself into comic books. It's the way that it went, that I was.
So you grew up in Pender, Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
Are there many traffic jams in Pender?
No, and in fact, when I was growing up, they did have one traffic light, but they took that out a number of years ago because the semis were going through there and they didn't want to stop at the traffic light. So they finally just took it out. So no, zero traffic jams in Pender, that's for sure.
How big is Pender?
Pender right now is about 1,000 people. When I grew up, there was about 1,200, but it's still a very vibrant community. It's got its own hospital and a new hospital, and it's an amazing town for northeastern Nebraska.
What were some of the pros and cons of growing up in a small town?
That's a very good question. Well, for me, one of the cons was that I was sort of an exotic kid. So there weren't a lot of people, there weren't a lot of friends that I had that really I could relate to. You know, I could relate to all of them to some extent, but there wasn't anybody that was like me really, or even close to like me. So that would be definitely a con. On the other hand, the pros were, I mean, it was, you didn't have to worry about your safety. And the people that were there that I grew up around were nice people. It's such a different time. Now, I think parents have to spend so much time making sure their kids are safe, or they feel like they do. Where when I was a kid, I would just run free. I'd do whatever the hell I wanted to do. And so that was too. Our parents never knew where we were. They just knew that we'd be home by dinner, and we always were. So I guess that was the pros and the cons, as I recall them anyway.
Some people, maybe a lot of people listening to this will feel like the exotic lone wolf in whatever community they are in. Maybe they're a middle schooler, maybe they're somewhere in adulthood. But what advice would you give to people who feel alone in their current circumstance, or feel lonely in their current circumstance?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I'm certainly no expert in it, but I think if you feel lonely, you just have to find a way to find people who are your people, as the saying is these days. You find your people. Your people are out there. I mean, it's in a smaller community, it's harder because there's fewer people to be with. But in a city, you can always find people that are similar enough to you that you can enjoy being with them. But you just have to. You can't. You can, but it's not a good idea to brood about it. The way to do it is just to do it, and just to go. Figure out what your interests are, and then go explore them, and you'll meet people that have similar interests as you do if you do that.
And now we have something you and I didn't have as kids. We have the internet, which makes finding people a whole different thing.
Totally, 100%. I mean, it's not even. It's incredible what you can do on the internet. The internet is a really wonderful thing in many ways, and then in other ways, it's a really bad thing. But in terms of finding people, there's nothing like it. I would have loved to have the internet when I was a kid.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine?
Really?
So you have a very interesting story about how you came to have your name. What was that story?
So my actual name is Alfred Drey Samuelson, and I'm named after my grandfather, whose name was Alfred Dreyfus Raun, R-A-U-N. He was born in 1899 when the Dreyfus Affair had just had reached its climax in France. Alfred Dreyfus was a captain in the French army. He was also Jewish, and there was evidence that there was a spy in the French military, and there was a spy, but they didn't know who it was, and for whatever reason, I think anti-Semitism really, they had to blame it on somebody. They figured, well, why not blame the Jew? So that's what they did. They court-martialed him, sent him to prison in Devil's Island, which is an island off the coast of South America that France, at that time anyway, owned. And he was there languishing until some people in France realized that this was a miscarriage of justice and did something about it. Anyway, my grandfather was born in 1899 at the height of all of the turmoil in France. And my great-grandparents decided to name their baby son after Alfred Dreyfus. And it's kind of a family mystery because they were not French and they were not Jewish, but he was a symbol of innocence. That's all that I know from my mom, was that he was a symbol of innocence, and everybody in the world pretty much knew that he was innocent. And so they named their baby son after Alfred Dreyfus. So I'm named after him. And the story that I can tell you that I think is sort of interesting, my first wife and I went to Paris in late 1990s. And I was always fascinated with Dreyfus' stories. And we found his grave in Montparnasse Cemetery. And I took out my business card, which just said Drey Samuelson. But I had a pen and I just wrote a little note on it. I said, my actual name is Alfred Dreyfus Samuelson, and I'm named after you. And I put it at the base of his grave underneath a rock, and just left it there. I just felt it was like putting a message in a bottle. So I forgot about it. Then 5 or 6 weeks later, our receptionist in Tim Johnson's office buzzed me, and she said, "There's somebody from Paris on the phone for you." And I thought, Paris? I thought maybe I'd left something there. But it turned out to be Alfred Dreyfus' great-grandson, whose mother, Dreyfus' granddaughter, had visited his grave and had found my card. And then she gave it to her son, Jean-Marc, who speaks fluent English, and called me to find out what this story was all about. And so I told him, and he was quite astonished that a Gentile baby in Nebraska was named after his famous great-grandfather. And he said, by the way, my wife and I are going to New York City next weekend, and if you want to come up, we'd love to have you for lunch. So my wife at that time, Lucy, and I drove up to New York City, had lunch with him, and he gave me a telegram some people from Maine had sent to his great-grandmother on Dreyfus' trial. And he gave it to me as a keepsake. And it was wonderful. I really liked him, really liked his wife, really liked his son. But the strangest thing about it was that Alfred Dreyfus' wife's name was Lucy, and that was my wife's name. And Alfred Dreyfus' brother's name, who helped prove his innocence, was named Matthew, and that's my brother's name. And my parents had no idea of any of that. They didn't know anything about Matthew Dreyfus, but that was that story. So the final sort of Lisa, my wife now, and I are going to France in May, and we are going to spend 2 days or 2 nights with Jean-Marc, Alfred Dreyfus' great-grandson that I was telling you about. So we're really looking forward to seeing him. We're going to see them in Normandy. They have a vacation home in Normandy. So that's that story. It's kind of interesting, I think.
It's amazing how things we do on a whim, things that we could easily talk ourselves out of, sometimes begin major stories like you could have so easily said, I'm not going to leave the business card. What does it matter? Why would I even do it?
Right.
But you trusted whatever that was, and you left it.
Yeah, and so it's funny you mentioned that, Jason. My brother Matthew, after I told him all this, he said, "Drey, you are the weirdest bastard that God ever put on this earth. Who would ever leave their business card at someone's grave?" I said, "Well, I couldn't argue with that, but it was an odd thing to do, but I'm glad I did it."
Speaking of things you're glad you did, how did you come to be interested in getting an MFA in fiction?
That is a good question. So everybody in my family is or was, when they were alive, a lawyer, and literally almost everybody other than my mom. But I didn't have any interest in being a lawyer. I was interested in politics, obviously, but I was also interested in making my mark in any way that I could that felt right to me. And the other way would be to be a novelist. And so I was very interested I went to graduate school in fiction writing at the University of Arizona after some political things I had done hadn't really worked out the way that I'd hoped. And so I found myself in graduate school with some people that became very well-known writers, including David Foster Wallace, who was one of my classmates, who was probably the most prominent literary fiction writer of his generation. And being around people like that, I realized that I didn't have the ability to make a living in all likelihood as a fiction writer, literary fiction writer, and I didn't want to teach. So I got back into politics. But that was what drove me to get my MFA, because I wanted to be a well-known, accomplished fiction writer. I have a big imagination. I mean, I have stories in my head that I thought I would give voice to, and I still may. I really haven't done much of it, but I was good enough to get into graduate school, and it was a very good school. So I think I have the ability to do it. The question is not so much ability with a lot of people, including me. The question is whether you have the drive to execute, and that's always a big question.
Because writing, like anything that someone doesn't create, it can kind of be easy to think, oh, it would be easy to write a book or whatever. But writing can be immensely challenging, huh?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to be really driven to write, because for one thing, you don't have any guarantees that anybody's going to read it, or that anybody would want to read it, or that they would even have it in front of them to read. So you have to just sort of believe in it. And one of my graduate teachers said that, you shouldn't write because you want to write. If you're going to write because you feel compelled to do it, and you just can't not do it. I don't. That's one of the reasons probably it's good that I didn't become a writer, because I can not write. I mean, it doesn't kill me not to write, but I still have stories that I think would be important to write, and that's what I want to do at some point in my life. We'll just see whether I live long enough to do it.
But you are driven when you find something that means a lot to you. Please talk about the Nebraska initiative yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah. So in 1981, I was working for Tom Daschle, Congressman Tom Daschle at that time, in Sioux Falls. And I wanted to get a job. I wanted to go to DC, but no one ever left. And when someone did leave, the one time they did, and I applied for the job, they didn't give it to me. And I thought, well, I don't feel like I was okay doing what I was doing, but I wasn't really being very challenged. And it just happened that somebody in Farmers Union, who I knew, said that there was a job in Nebraska, working for Nebraska Farmers Union, and they asked me to apply for it, and I did, and I got hired. And the job turned out to be to run a ballot initiative in Nebraska to stop non-family farm corporations from buying farmland in Nebraska or expanding livestock operations, both. And I took the job. The first part of the job was to get it on the ballot. We had to get 49,500 signatures, and in just a matter of about 4 months, which is really, really hard. We didn't have any money to hire people. But what we did have is we had a lot of farmers that were interested in it, because these big insurance companies had been buying a lot of farmland in Nebraska, and they didn't like it, and for good reason. And so we put it on. We got the signatures. We got it on the ballot, and then in August, there was a group in Nebraska of conservative people that held a press conference and said they were going to raise and spend $500,000 to beat our initiative, which was really a stupid thing for them to say, because that just gave us ammunition to use against them, which we did. But we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, hardly, really. This was all a grassroots, totally initiative, and the whole Nebraska establishment was against us. The Omaha World Herald ran something like 5 editorials against us. I mean, it was David versus Goliath. But we hung in there, and on election night, we ended up not only winning, we won 56% to 44%. And we didn't do very well in Lincoln and Omaha. I think we had probably lost them both, but we crushed them in rural Nebraska, because rural people knew what was at stake, and they voted in gigantic numbers to pass Initiative 300, as it was called. And it was one of the highlights of my life.
You were outspent by a vast amount of money. Like,
we were about 13 to 1.
You said 13 to 1.
Yeah.
So in life, in various circumstances, we as humans come up against a David and Goliath fight, where we happen to be David. And
I've never been Goliath. I'd like to try that sometime, but he died. Maybe I don't want to try that.
and it's tempting in a fight like that to say, oh my gosh, it's no use. I'm going to get crushed, and to freeze or run, to avoid. What are your ideas about sticking with a fight if you know it's right, if you know it's important?
Well, that's a very good question, Jason. I can see that you're a very good interviewer. So I think the answer is that you, just as being a writer, you have to figure out a way to believe in yourself or your cause. You get over the bumps that are in the road, and that's true for ballot initiatives. You know, it's hard to get a ballot initiative qualified, and then once you get it on the ballot, then you have to raise the money and persuade people to vote for you. But you just have to feel you have to feel driven enough to get you over the bumps. That's about the only way I can put it. And if the bumps stop you, then you're not going to get it done. But you have to just do the best you can, knowing that there's no guarantees that you're going to have success. But what you do know is if you don't try, you definitely won't have success. So sometimes you try things that they don't work, and you just have to dust yourself off and go back and try something else until it does. But oftentimes, at least in my life, I've had some success, even when on the surface it would look like this was kind of a crazy thing to do.
Just think if you had been in the job interview for the initiative and heard about it and heard about the odds and got, oh, this isn't going to work. I love the cause, but it's not going to work, and you told them sorry.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't have been part of accomplishing this.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, you also have to know that some things are impossible, that you can't do them, or they're not worth the effort to try, because your success is very, very unlikely. And I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think that we could pass it. So you have to have some belief that you can do it, but it doesn't have to be assurance, because it's never assured generally. You just have to have some feeling that it can be done, and that you think that you can make a difference. I think the key in life, in my opinion, is figuring out what I can do that other people that I'm going to be the best person to do X, whatever X is. If somebody else could do it just as well as I can, then I should let them do it, and I should find something else that no one else can do as well as I can. And I think to me, that's one of the key things to keep in mind in life, is to figure out where you plug in better than anybody else does.
Speaking of doing something well and for a long period of time, how did you meet this man, Tim Johnson, who had the idea of running for Congress?
Well, that was a good question. It underlines what I just said. I mean, in terms of having a belief. I mean, when Tim Johnson decided to run for the House of Representatives, virtually nobody believed that he was going to win the primary. He was running against an accomplished state senator. Also, Tim was a state senator as well, but one that was a farmer. Tim was a lawyer, and was much more outgoing and extroverted. Tim, like me, is an introvert, and he's not a backslapper. And so just on the face of it, running a lawyer against a farmer in the middle of a farm crisis, with the farmer being the extrovert and the lawyer being an introvert, it's not a recipe for likely success. And
so you're attracted to the David and Goliath thing. I'm seeing.
I think that's right. I didn't really put it in that context, but that's probably right. And they were both Democrats, and so they had to run against whoever the Republicans would nominate. And everybody thought that Dale Bell, who had almost beaten Tom Daschle, or had given a real scare to Tom Daschle 2 years before in 1984, was almost the hands-on likely winner. And in fact, Dave Kranz, who was the political columnist for the Argus Leader at the time, wrote that some labor leaders came out to South Dakota to scout the race out, and then they just left saying, this race is over. Dale Bell is going to win. Then there's no chance that any Democrat, whether it's Tim Johnson or whomever, was just doomed to lose. Jim Berg was the candidate running against us on the Democratic side, but I didn't believe that was the case necessarily, and I had enough confidence in, after having won the ballot initiative in Nebraska, that I thought we probably did have a chance. And I loved Tim. Tim was a great candidate, even though he wasn't a backslapper, but in other ways he was an excellent candidate. And we won the primary by about 2%. And then once we got in the general election, we just crushed Dale Bell. We beat him 59% to 41%. And which was unheard of. It's not going to happen in my lifetime in South Dakota. I can tell you that a Democrat wins a statewide race by that margin, or right now it feels like any margin to some extent. But anyway, that's how that went down.
So eventually Tim ran for Senate and won, and you're suddenly chief of staff. Had you ever gone to school to be a chief of staff?
No, I should have, but they didn't have such a school. And I didn't know what I was getting into, but I was smart enough to know that I didn't have all the answers in how to be a chief of staff. Now, that was in the House, but I hired someone that had been a chief of staff, my buddy John Devereaux, who was the chief of staff to a congressman named Berkeley Bedell that was from the northwest part of Iowa. And he and I ran this. I had the title of chief of staff, but he was just as much a chief of staff as I am. I don't have any ego about being in control. And I find life much more interesting if it's collaborative rather than if I'm dictating the action. I don't like to do that. And I think it's just fun to do it with another person. So he was my partner in running Tim's staff, and we're still very close friends.
So you had the opportunity to do a new job and you realized that you were new to it, so you hired someone
Yeah.
with experience.
Yeah. I was smart enough to realize to know what I didn't know. And I also knew that the Republicans were going to be gunning for us. They were not happy to have this House seat occupied by a Democrat. And I knew we were going to be under siege. And one of the smartest thing I did was to hire John Devereaux to do it. He not only had sort of administered the office in some ways in the technical aspects, but he was also our press secretary. And he was really good at that. In fact, interestingly, when I applied for a job when I was working for Tom Daschle, the job that I wanted was to be Tom Daschle's press secretary. And I applied for that job. And instead of giving it to me, they gave it to John Devereaux. So, but I didn't really even know him that well. I just knew that he was hired instead of me, but he was who they should have hired instead of me. So I didn't have any bitterness because he was a really good press secretary and a really good human being. But it's just ironic that I hired him, despite the fact that he'd been chosen over me by Tom Daschle.
So you really believe in collaboration. You could have held a grudge against this man for taking the job you wanted your whole life, but instead you're like, he's really good at what he does. I want him on my team.
Right. Yeah. I had no reason to hold a grudge against anybody. I mean, Tom made the decision he made, and frankly, in retrospect, it was absolutely the right decision. And I certainly couldn't blame John Devereaux. So no, it was really one of the smartest moves I made. And when I worked for Tim in the House, maybe the smartest move.
With modern life, there's so much going on. It's hard for anyone at any level doing anything to be organized. How do you figure out how to? So you have a new job you've never had before. How do you figure out how to organize your days when there's? I can't imagine how much is going on. What is going on?
Well, I mean, I relied on John. I mean, he'd been the chief of staff for Berkeley Bedell for 4 years, and or 2 years, I can't remember what, but he knew how to do it, and so I was very reliant upon him as to. I mean, I think I could have figured it out. They do have a book that you can read when your boss takes office, but I didn't really need that book because I had John, and we're both smart. We could figure it out. It's not rocket science, but it was daunting. It was, and that was one of the advantages of hiring John, is that he knew how to do it.
How about dealing with I imagine a job like that is pretty stressful.
Oh, it was stressful, yeah. But I'll say this: one of the great things about working for Tim Johnson is he didn't make it more stressful than it needed to be. He was not a stress adder, and a lot of members of Congress are. There's plenty of members of Congress they're not necessarily. I mean, a lot of them have good values, but a lot of them are not necessarily nice people. Tim is good values and a very nice man, and he didn't add stress to us at all. So that made my job, and I think all of our job, much more easy. It's not easy jobs, but it made it as easy as it could be, and he didn't make it harder than it needed to be. And that was one of the reasons I stayed with him all 28 years, is just because, he made the job easy to do, and it was a good job. So he didn't get in my way or anybody else's way. I mean, he could be demanding. You had to get your job done, obviously, but he wasn't somebody that was an ogre or somebody throwing his weight around. That's just not who he was. Thank God.
Wow. Well, s- um, what what are some things that an ordinary person like me wouldn't know about being a wouldn't know about a job like being a chief of staff or a senator?
I don't know. I'm not sure I can answer that. I don't know. It's not. It's you don't have to. I mean, you have to know something about politics. You have to know something about how a bill becomes a law. You have to know something about policy. But I think in terms of, you also have to be empathic. Really, that's what the biggest quality I think in being a good leader of any kind,
Mm.
whether it's a chief of staff or anything, is being empathic. So to I didn't run roughshod over people. As far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure that I didn't. I would always just try to work with people. But I think the main thing is just to develop your sense of empathy, and obviously have to put in the time and the work. But it really wasn't. It wasn't work really because I enjoyed the job. I mean, there was parts of it I didn't like, obviously, like any job. But I think just to be an empathic manager is, I think that's the main thing in terms of my what I did and my feeling about it.
How what in your life were the people who taught you about empathy, or how did you learn to be an empathetic person?
That's a good question. Um, I learned that from. I mean, my dad was empathic, certainly, but my mom was very empathetic. I mean, I sort of take after her in my personality much more than I do my dad. My dad was a very good man, but I learned empathy really from my mom. My mom was born, interestingly, with a club foot and also a curved spine, and she
Mm.
was also missing some bones in the leg that had the club foot. So I mean, she was told, or her mother was told, my grandmother was told that she would never probably walk,
Wow.
but she did, and in fact, went on to be a cheerleader. So she was able to be active physically, but she was also, because she had this disability that had made her much more sensitive, I think, and she passed that sensitivity on. At least I believe she did to me.
It gives me goosebumps to think of how kindness ripples out, like your mom had this experience, so she was sensitive and empathetic. She passed it on to you, and then you're going through work days in the Capitol and spreading this gift
No,
to
that's
countless people. That's pretty amazing.
well. I think all of us have influence much greater than we know, and we're not really even aware of it. But that's right. I mean, I think that's a good way to look at it, Jason. Is that you don't know what impact you're going to have with people, and you're not that you can go through your entire life and not have any real sense for the impact that you've had on people, but nonetheless you do. And certainly she had that impact on me, and I hope that I've passed that benefit on to other people. I believe that I have, um, but I hope that I have.
So on what happened on December 13th, 2006?
So that was the day that my boss Tim Johnson had a very serious brain hemorrhage. Um, uh, I was spent some of the morning at home, and was driving in, and I got a call on my cell phone from our scheduler, receptionist, not receptionist, scheduler, who sat right outside Tim's office. And she told me on the phone when I was about 3 miles away from Capitol Hill that there was something wrong with Tim. And she didn't really know what it was, but she described his symptoms to me. And I knew it, that was pretty sure, didn't know, but I was pretty sure that he had just had a stroke. Because my dad had a stroke in 1997 and died from it. And so I knew the symptoms, and I rushed to get there. And when I got there, Tim was in a sort of a dazed state. He was conscious, but he was sitting on the couch in front of the office, and they had called the Capitol physician who was there, and they have people on staff because this does happen occasionally. Bad things happen, and so they ran, and they could see that he had some, like a stroke is what they thought originally. And they rushed him to the hospital, to GW Hospital, and I followed in my car and got there. And then Barb, his wife, was there, and then Kelsey, his daughter, was there soon at that time too. And it was horrible. I mean, we were told that it wasn't clear that he was going to live, and we were there that night. They told Barb that there was a good chance that if he did live, he wouldn't be in very good shape, but she had to approve having the brain operation, which of course she did, and I just remember the surgeon telling us that he said, God, this gets me kind of choked up. He told us that he was only about 35 years old, but he said, I can do this, and he's going to be fine. Not fine, but he's going to get pulled through this. And then for the next 6 hours, we were in this room with Tom, with Tom Daschle and Tim's family, and Harry Reid, and it was hit or miss whether he was going to make it. But it was interesting. Every 45 minutes or so, somebody would come in from the hospital staff and give us a report on how Tim was doing. And when the door would open, you would look at whether this guy was smiling or not, and he was always smiling. But if he hadn't been smiling, you would think, oh man, Tim didn't make it. But he was always smiling, thank goodness. And so he made it through.
Was he in a coma for a while?
Yes, he was in a coma for, as I remember it, 3 or 4 weeks. And it wasn't clear that he was going to come out of the coma for sure. I came back to Nebraska. This was for Christmas, and I was afraid to answer my phone because I was always afraid there was going to be terrible news, but it never was, thankfully.
I heard the story, of course, but I never thought of this moment. But what was it like when Tim came back to the Senate the day he came back?
Well, it was very emotional. I remember when I went, this isn't exactly directly to your question, but when I came, when Tim came out of the coma, Barb invited me to come in. I've never told this to anybody. But I gave him a hug, and he kissed me. He was just so happy to come out and be alive. Anyway, that's
Wow.
fairly,
That must have been an amazing moment for
it was.
both. Oh.
Anyway, yeah. When Tim came back to the Senate, he gave a speech, and he couldn't speak very well. I mean, he had to teach himself how to speak again. He had to teach him how to do everything. Really, because he was all but dead. Really, I mean, he was really just barely alive when he came through with this. So anyway, he gave a speech to the Senate, and we were there, and it was very emotional, as you can imagine. And he couldn't talk very well, but he could talk well enough. And my my memory of one of my memories, one of my best memories, my most fond memories of that was watching the senator from Indiana, Richard Lugar, who was a Republican and a really nice human being. And he had this big grin on his face, just ear to ear the whole time Tim was speaking. And it was so reaffirming. So that's my favorite memory of that speech.
I didn't expect her to go here, but do you have any ideas how we get back to that just love and support of each other in politics? It seems like things are so just angry and stressful right now in the political arena.
Well, I think my answer is, I mean, I don't know that I have any one answer, but the answer that I have right now is I think we need to get rid of closed partisan primaries, which is what I'm working on in South Dakota. I think the closed partisan primaries where a Democrat is pitted against a Republican divides us, and we nominate people who are usually much more extreme than the average person. And I think if we had a single unified primary where everybody voted, including independents and Republicans and Democrats and libertarians or whatever else, we would nominate people more in the middle, and we would not have the terrible anger that's infected our politics. And it's not like one thing is going to fix it. But that will mitigate it. That will make it better. And that's all we can do really, is to try and make things better. I'm not a revolutionary. There's no one answer to make it better, but I think that's the best answer I can come up with.
So just for everyone, so everyone knows what is a closed primary and what is an open primary?
That's a good question. So closed primary is what we have in South Dakota. Republicans vote in the Republican primary, and the Democrats vote in the Democratic primary. And we nominate.
And across the United States, it's usually closed primaries, right?
Yeah, not entirely, but mostly. There are about 4 or 5 states that have open primaries.
Okay.
California is a state that has an open primary. Washington State has an open primary. Alaska now has open primaries with ranked choice voting. The Nebraska legislature, my home state, is open primary, but only for the legislature, not for anything else. And Louisiana has a version of an open primary, but every other state is all run by closed partisan primaries, which I think is very unfortunate.
So how is the open primary different?
So an open primary is everybody votes on primary day, but on one ballot. So they vote, maybe there might be 6 candidates that would run, just to say, and the top 2 would be nominated. And it could be the top 2 would be both Republicans, top 2 theoretically could be Democrats or whatever. But if my opinion is if everybody voted in the primary, in the unified open primary, you'd have to if you wanted to be the nominee, you would have to appeal to everybody. And right now, in a closed partisan primary, you don't have to appeal to everybody. You have to appeal only to the people that vote in your primary. And generally, the people who vote in primaries are more ideologically extreme. So we end up nominating people for office that are more extreme than the average person. And I don't think that's healthy. So
this could radically, I mean, this this issue sounds like it's a pretty bipartisan.
Yeah,
I
we
mean,
have
it affects either party. It's not.
yeah the parties. We have Republicans and Democrats. I'm obviously a Democrat, but we have Republicans and Democrats that are part of this, and we just want the government to work. Right now, government is not working very well, and we think if we had open primaries, it would work a fair amount better. And I'm convinced of it, or I wouldn't be doing this. But yeah, I think that's right.
So, just a shout out to people who collect petitions. I was at the South Dakota State Fair in August, and it's really hot, and people are out collecting petitions for open primaries. And last night I was out somewhere, and it was cold, and someone was out collecting petitions.
Mm-hmm. It's hard
I
work.
mean, what inspires people to do this work that would be really challenging? And
Just the belief in wanting to change something that they believe so strongly needs to be changed, and that's what it is. I mean, some people do get paid for it. I'm not going to lie about that, but a chunk of our signatures are also done by volunteers who feel very strongly that government is not working very well and we need to do something different.
so we were talking a bit before we got on today about I feel, and I imagine a lot of people feel grief about not being able to do more to help things in the world, like the Middle East. There's so much pain going on there right now, and
Mm-hmm.
I would love to be able to help more, but but mm, yeah, but what is your feeling on how do we direct our energy towards what we can change instead of being in constant mourning about all the things that are that we can or don't have time or whatever?
Yeah, I think we have to figure out where we plug in best, and I think we all have to know that success is never assured, or generally not assured, when we try to do something. Certainly not in the political area, but you've got to the right thing to do, I think, is to try and change what you think you can change that would make a life better for everyone. And so I think that's what we have to do, is just to try and focus on what we can do, and not beat ourselves up because we can't do some things. I mean, you and I, Jason, are not going to do anything to change the Middle East situation, which is ongoing tragedy. All we can do is maybe send money to relief or something, or just But there's a lot of that is just not outside. It's just outside of our ability to do it, and I think we have to realize that and focus on the things that we can do, because there's plenty of things that we can do, and we need to do those things because we can do them.
Speaking of something you can do, and thanks for setting me up perfectly to ask this question, because I might have forgotten. Would you please talk about what happened yesterday and what organization that benefits?
I'm sorry, what happened yesterday?
Yeah, the land auction.
Okay, sure.
You remember that big thing that happened down in Nebraska?
Well, I did. I didn't know why anybody'd be interested in that. But so, yeah, I have my brother and I inherited some farmland, about 550 acres of farmland, and we're selling it. And we had an auction yesterday that we sold about half of it. But I think what's most interesting that makes it a little unusual is that my brother and I decided to donate a 120-acre parcel of land to a nonpartisan nonprofit in Nebraska called Civic Nebraska.
And what does Civic Nebraska do?
Well, they do a number of things. They have after-school programs for children is one of the things I know that they do. They focus some of their attention on rural health, which is a real problem. But the thing which attracts me to them most is their support for open primaries, for democracy reform, just in general. And democracy is excuse me, is something that we've inherited. Just as my brother and I inherited this farmland, we've inherited the democracy in this country, and we need to do what we can to protect it. And that's why Matt and I donated this 120 acres parcel, which is worth quite a bit of money, to Civic Nebraska, and it was sold yesterday. And so we hope that will be used, and I'm sure it will be, to promote democracy reforms in Nebraska, and then beyond that, maybe in the rest of the country. We'll see.
I get the image of things rippling out as you say that.
Well, that's the hope. I mean, that's what I think all of us have create. Excuse me. Some of us can create bigger ripples than others, but all of us can create ripples. And I think that's incumbent on us to do that.
I think back again to talking about your mom's ripple and how she taught you about empathy and how that's rippled out into the halls of Congress.
Yep.
So Drey, I ask all my guests this. And what I do, I talk about the power of doing our imperfect best. And the definition of it for me keeps expanding as I think more about it and have more experience with it. But basically what it means to me is we go for the best we want in life, and when obstacles or mistakes come up, instead of quitting what we want, we learn from that stuff and move forward. What does doing your imperfect best mean to you?
What that means to me is, God knows I'm not remotely a perfect person, and whatever I do is not going to be perfect. But also, it's just basically, I think, about realizing that you're going to do the best that you can, and by doing that, you're going to make some advances in what you're working on, and at least that's the hope. There's no guarantees that you're going to be able to do it, but means that just because you're not going to do something perfectly doesn't mean you're not going to be able to make that you shouldn't do it, or that you're not going to have some success doing it. I mean, none of us, we all have our issues that hinder us one way or the other, but we can't let those stop us. It's like the bumps in the road that I talked about as a writer. They're inevitable. They're going to have them. And you're going to have some personal issues that are going to make success somewhat harder, depending on what it is. But all of us have it. And the main thing is just to keep, plugging forward, keep at it. Nothing happens without persistence, really. Nothing good happens without persistence. If it was easy, it had already been done. But you just have to believe in the cause and believe that you can have a good chance to make a difference. And that's, I think, what that means to me, at least.
Wonderful, very powerful. Thank you. If someone wants to know more about open primaries and the concept, should they just Google open primaries, or is there a specific website?
Yeah, this South Dakota open primaries is just Google South Dakota open primaries. That will take you to our website, and that will explain a lot of it. Or people can contact me. I'm on Facebook, and I'm happy to be Facebook friends with anybody that wants to be a Facebook friend of me. So just contact me if they want, or go to our website. Either one it would be fine.
What is that? Are you the first Drey Samuelson that comes up on Facebook, or how would they?
Trust me on this, Jason. I'm the only Drey Samuelson on Facebook. That's
Eh,
the if your name is Drey, you're not. There's not a lot of us out there for sure.
As someone with the name Jason Freeman, I'm a bit jealous of that because there's a lot of Jason Freemans.
Yeah, there's probably a few. I'm sure there is, but there's only there's only one you, Jason Freeman. So you do a very damn good job. I can tell you that, and I hope you're proud of it.
That is definitely true. There's only one Jason Freeman. Well, thanks so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for taking the time to do this, and I look forward to our future conversations.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Jason. I didn't know that I was going to be so emotional in this. Jesus, you're a good interviewer, and you've pushed the right buttons on me to get me to sort of dig a little deeper than I thought that I would. I didn't really anticipate, but that's good. We're human beings, and we have emotions, and I'm not embarrassed that I showed it. It's just it certainly wasn't my plan. I can tell you that.
Thanks so much for being willing to go on this hour-long journey with me and to share what there was to be shared. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I really do, and I'm glad you do this. I think you're quite a skilled interviewer, and I look forward to following some of your interviews now that I know that you do this.
Cool. Thank you. Oh my. When I was in middle school, I couldn't think of questions to ask the people around me. I felt so isolated. I just and I felt things would never change. Why do I mention this? I mention this because the art of being a good conversationalist, a good listener, asking good questions, I'm proof is very much a learned art. If you want to become better at it, practice it. I practice it every day, and it's rewarding because I get to talk to people like Drey, and wasn't his story and his encouragement and what he's been involved in wasn't that amazing. So thanks for tuning into Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. I'm still your host, Jason Freeman. I still have a speech impediment, and I'm still using it as a gift. With a T on the end. Please tune in next week for another episode. Thanks for being you.